Welcome to the KPW podcast and the C's Baseball podcast. And we're pleased today to be joined by Paul Hembekides, who co-authored a new book with Mike Greenberg. It's called Got Your Answers, the 100 Greatest Sports Arguments Settled. It's published by Hyperion Avenue in September 2024. And Stan Markotich is my co-host joining us today. So welcome both of you. Hembo, thanks for joining us today. I know we got a short window today, so let's just get started. Stan, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, actually, some really great lists. And yeah, that's going to lead to quite a few arguments. I don't want to spoil anything, but I've got so many questions, and 20 minutes isn't going to be long enough. Number eight, number eight. You have a rather controversial number one response to who is, I forget the wording of the question, the most famous person or the most accomplished athlete to hold number eight. How did you resolve that debate?
Excruciatingly. Not to spoil the ending, as you put it, but what we did for chapter 8, which is entitled "Who are the top 8 athletes to wear number 8?" There are, I think, any number of obvious people in consideration. I'll call it descending order from number 8. Steve Young, obvious. Carl Yastrzemski, obvious. Joe Morgan, Troy Aikman. They comprise the bottom half of that top 8. And then we go Yogi Berra at 4, Cal Ripken Jr. at 3, Alex Ovechkin at 2, and Kobe Bryant at number 1. Now, I want to be very clear. If we were only to take or input the value that Kobe Bryant generated while wearing the number 8 and none while wearing the number 24, well, it goes without saying that Kobe Bryant would not only not be 1, but he'd probably be somewhere in the back half of the top 8 in all honesty. But he basically split his career directly in half. And so what we elected to do, both for this book and our previous version in which he was chapter 8, was take Kobe Bryant's career in its totality and compare it to all of the other athletes that wore number 8, because of course we all know that for number 24, it's going to be Willie Mays until the end of time, right? And so that's sort of the basis of how we got to where we got. All that being said, if you and I had the same conversation, let's say 5 years from now, there's a non-zero chance, maybe even a better one, that Alex Ovechkin, who's going to be the all-time leading scorer in the history of the NHL, will be unassailably, inarguably the greatest number 8 of all time. However, as things stand right this second, when comparing the totality of Kobe Bryant's career to Ovechkin's career or anyone else's career that wore number 8, that's where we netted out. We sort of show you the back of the napkin that we sort of used to get to that place for our first book, Got Your Number. And here we give you a top 8 and got your answers. But look, the whole point of this is to debate. So I need you to tell me what your objections are, if any, in terms of where we netted out with chapter number 8.
Yeah, it was just yeah, I think it's a split number issue. The fact that I remember Kobe is 24. That's the first thing that comes to mind. So when I came to that part of the book, I thought, oh, well, interesting choice. How is it justified? And I read the entry and uh, great explanation. But it also seemed that you were maybe debating the possibility or the prospect of taking that as your number one 8 choice.
There's no question. In fact, if we were to make an addendum, a revision, an edit of any kind, I would argue that Ovechkin at chapter 8, Willie Mays at 24, and Kobe at 81 might be the more appropriate way to stack these things out if we're looking to do so, because he's not synonymous with just one number. If you're looking to accompany him with just one number, well, I think you could argue that 81 would be that number, the second most points scored in a single game in the history of the NBA. We know Wilt Chamberlain held up the 100, but 81 in the year in which Kobe Bryant did it, 2006, if memory serves. But either way, the whole point, I mean, 81 is an astronomical figure. And in Got Your Number, we put Terrell Owens at 81. But if you're just to attach one number to Kobe Bryant, I think you can make a strong, cogent argument that that might be the best and more honest one, considering he could own that number and not have to split it between 8 and 24.
Right.
It's a fantastic point. I'll just jump in for a moment. Thanks, gentlemen. You mentioned a couple of things that I want to just jump in with. What's so great about this book is that it covers all eras. Like we're talking about, let's say, you mentioned Wilt Chamberlain. Let's say, I was stunned that I would have assumed that, his most unbreakable NBA record would be the 100-point game, but in fact, it was at the bottom of the list of the top five. And so that blew me away because I would have assumed, without looking at the list beforehand, that number one of his top five most unbreakable NBA scoring records would be the 100-point game, but it was not. And the other point also was mentioned about Yogi Berra, different time periods. Like I also found it fascinating that like the most lopsided trades of all time in Major League Baseball, you included, or Greeny included, Christy Mathewson in 1900, listed in the top five of that. That's a name that is, important in baseball history. Even like, actually, it wasn't NBA, sorry, it wasn't MLB. Lopsided trade history of all time. It also included the Russell Wilson NFL trade from 2022. The Christy Masterson trade a lot higher than the Brett Favre from Atlanta to the Green Bay Packers trade in 1992. So it covers all time period. But I want to mention specifically Cal Ripken because you mentioned that. I believe you're a big Cal Ripken guy. Hembo, the top 10 MVP snubs. I still to this day don't believe that Cal Ripken Jr. deserved the MVP in 1991 because the Orioles were second last in the division that year, almost lost 100 games. They lost 95. That's what I wanted to throw out there. But, Stan or Hembo, you guys can continue.
Let me briefly address the 1991 American League MVP race. Because Cal Ripken Jr., like you said, is my guy, but that doesn't mean that I'm not still open to persuasion. The MVP snubs chapter is genuinely one of my favorites because not only can it be perceived as besmirching the player that won, but in most of these cases, it would have required a Herculean effort or an all time great season that is overlooked. And in the case of the 1991 American League MVP, I mean, Cal Ripken Jr. generated 11 and a half WAR that year for, like you said, a god awful baseball team. But he was considerably the best player in baseball. It's not close. Roger Clemens had fewer than 8. Ken Griffey Jr. fewer than 8. Greg Thompson with 7. So to me, the whole point of that list, the greatest MVP snubs of all time, is to recognize players that had all-time great seasons that did not even win the MVP. So you could make a straightforward argument that because Cal Ripken Jr. played on as bad a team as he played, that he did not deserve the MVP that year. I'll disagree, but that's something that we can have between the 20-yard lines. But then what I need from you is a persuasive argument that someone else was overwhelmingly more deserving, and that's why no one from the 1991 American League MVP race made the list.
Dan?
No, based on individual performance, I have no argument with that. I think that's actually great reasoning. So, Hembo, I'd take that.
Good deal. Cosign, I appreciate that.
Yeah.
I'll just jump back in there for a moment. Now, I understand that most of the lists belong to Greeny, but there were a couple of lists that Hembo, you yourself came up with. I just want to kind of get touch base on that because Hembo, there's one particular list that was all yours. It was like the perfect all-time baseball lineup according to Hembo, and you had Barry Bonds leading off, of course. And I know that Greeny disagreed with it and listed Ricky Henderson on his list. How did you decide that you would have your own list independent of Greeny in that situation, or was it tough to like not have more lists of your own?
That's a great question. So the vast majority of these chapters are ones for which we aggregated our knowledge and opinion and spat out, in most cases, a top 10 that we generally agreed upon based on who won in the persuasion. Like he and I basically had, approximately 100 debates to determine each of these lists. But our lineups were so different. And I think in some sense, a function of not only our age, but a function of the history or the statistics that we value historically, that we felt it would be more instructive to do separate lineups. And so this is not one for which there are right and wrong answers, at least not necessarily. These are, however, so different that we felt it would add value to the book to provide both perspectives. And Greeny's 100% right in saying that Ricky Henderson is the greatest leadoff hitter of all time, but only because Barry Bonds was not. If Barry Bonds had been a leadoff hitter, he would have been the greatest leadoff hitter of all time. So what I was looking to do is basically just use the numerics to spit out what would be the single best lineup in the history of baseball for run scoring maximization. And there's a 0% question, in my opinion, that if Barry Bonds was leading off, my team would score more runs than Ricky Henderson leading off, because Barry Bonds is at minimum one of the 5 greatest hitters of all time, and Ricky Henderson is not anywhere in the top 15 or 20. So that's the 30,000-foot view of how we got to where we got, and the reason for why I have Barry Bonds leading off for my all-time lineup.
Stan, I believe you had some points you wanted to discuss.
Yeah, I have a lot of questions. Actually, just well, I think baseball is on the list. I can't remember the category, but it was the most. I think it was the most coveted sports titles. Was that one of the? Yeah, and you have the WWE title listed among other. But I was going down the list and I thought, yep, yeah, I agree. And I got to WWE, and my question was, how did that get on the list?
Great question. And it's not the first time I fielded that question. I will readily acknowledge that the WWE Championship belt is different from the other 9 on this list. However, what Greeny and I determined was that that's sport, if you will, has consumed enough of our consciousness that it was worthy of consideration when considering the object. So the way that we think about this, like winning a gold glove is not more esteemed than winning an MVP, but the gold glove itself, the object, the item, is far more recognizable. So the way that we thought about it was the combination of the accomplishment with what it might look like in your Zoom background as sort of the way to think about it. So like if you had a Zoom background filled with gold gloves, that would obviously be quite a flex, just like it would be if you had a WWE Championship belt. And so the idea here was not only accomplishment, but recognizability of the object or item itself. And that's why we landed on the WWE Championship belt being inside the top 10.
Okay, got it. So, I mean, I was actually paused for quite a while reading that list, just thinking about that question. Why the WWE? Why not the NWA? And I think you partly answered that question because you've got, I'm not talking about any current incarnation of the NWA, but I was thinking of people like Fez and Kaniski and Gagne, and I thought, well, there you've got something that looks like people actually really fought and eye gouged over, so.
No, I understand your point, but you think about all the places in society now where you'll see a replica of the belt. Like if a college football team, comes away with an interception, they'll throw this belt on the defensive back that came away with it. It's become sort of ubiquitous in our society, and for that reason, we felt it was worthy of including in the top 10, even though we're doing it, at least to some extent, tongue in cheek.
Right. Got it. Thank you.
Now, another top 10 list was Game 7s. And I
love that list. I love that list.
I was quite surprised to see Kelly Rudy. I know about that game, against the Washington Capitals, but I was quite surprised that was the only hockey one that came up.
Me too, actually. That was so that's one. You make sure I want to pull the chapter up in my book, so I'm gonna make sure that I'm looking at this honestly. I'm just doing this on the fly. One thing we did not include was a table of contents. Well done, publisher. So I'm looking at it right. What are the top 7 Game 7 performances? Chapter 18 in your hymnals. In addition to the sneaky Hembo trivia question, which there are 100 of, what we decided we wanted to do for Game 7 was just choose 7 and not 10. Now, if we would have chosen 10, I'd have to go back into my archive because I obviously logged every Game 7 from all the 4 major sports. I'm sure a hockey would have made the list in 8, 9, or 10, although I can't tell you that I have one on the top of my head. But that 73 save performance, even though, relatively speaking, it was in the context of what it was in compared to all the others, is the stuff of legend. It was genuinely one of the greatest hockey performances of all time. But for whatever reason, I was stunned at how few standout hockey performances there were in Game 7s. From a scoring standpoint, there were none that really stood apart. And the deeper you got into the playoffs, oddly enough, there were none that really stood apart. The other thing, too, is every other one on this list is so recognizable to the average sports fan. Everyone remembers the Jack Morris game. The Walt Frazier game is the greatest Game 7 all time played in basketball. Everyone remembers the LeBron James chase down block, the Bill Mazeroski home run, the Sandy Koufax shove in the 1965 World Series. And, of course, I wanted to include a Bill Russell game because he was Mr. Game 7. So I was also surprised at how little hockey representation there was in Game 7. But my favorite thing about this book, above everything else, is the fact that we have so many sort of cross-sport lists And I think it's one of the unique things about our book is that we try to do the best we can to scientifically blend them all together to spit out these lists. Unfortunately, there were only 7 choices for Game 7.
I'm not a Toronto Maple Leafs fan or LA Kings fan, but I'm sure hockey fans would pick Gretzky's Game 7 performance in '93 against Toronto as among the top
It was on
Game
my list, but
7s.
how am I going to put that ahead of a home run that won the World Series?
But that wouldn't be included on my list.
Okay.
Just,
That's
yeah,
no, like it's a fair argument. Like there are a million arguments, but there are only 7 entries.
that's right. And the one thing you just touched on, we appreciate the fact you guys included all sports across different eras, like I mentioned. One I wanted to kind of touch on as well is top 10 NFL coach quarterback tandems or
Mm.
duels. Sean Payton and Drew Brees at number 8 with the Saints. Did you argue a lot about that one? Because they did not have the championships, but they had a lot of successful seasons. Could that have gone higher or even lower, in your opinion?
I think they could have been as low as 10. My personal opinion is that we have Paul Brown and Otto Graham ranked a little bit too low. The success that they enjoyed in Cleveland was astronomical, of course, but much of that came in the AAFC, which is why we have them there. Only one championship for Sean Payton and Drew Brees. They do a lot of high level winning, and I think all of us that watched that game against the Rams, in which they were just absolutely screwed out of a chance to win, know that they might well have won the Super Bowl that season. The reason that Brees and Peyton are where they are is because the offenses were prolific, as we well know. They won an extraordinary number of games over a prolonged period of time and kind of renovated the way that the NFL played offense. The Saints had never had a winning tradition before the two of them arrived. So they they walked this path sort of hand in hand, which is why we have Sean Payton and Drew Brees and not Ben Roethlisberger and Mike Tomlin in our top 10, even though a lot of people would argue that Tomlin and Roethlisberger were winninger, if you will, than Brees and Payton. And so there's a little bit of art along with the science with this list, but for the most part, it's just accomplishment. You could make a good faith argument they don't belong in the top 10. I'm comfortable where we have them, although if you argue they should be at 9 or 10, I certainly wouldn't kill you for it.
The book is Got Your Answers, the 100 Greatest Sports Arguments Settled. Stan, I know you have some more questions. Why don't we get some of those in?
Go.
Oh yeah, lots of questions. Well, what are the top 10 most memorable Olympic moments? And a question that just keeps coming back over and over, as I recall that list, is how did Jesse Owens come in number 2 after Miracle on Ice? How is that possible?
Well, the word memorable is the one doing all the legwork in that sentence. There's no argument that Jesse Owens in 1936 was the most significant thing that has ever happened, arguably, in the history of the Olympics. Of that, there is no question. But let's consider the context here. The Miracle on Ice was played on our home soil. It was televised in our home country, and a lot of people saw it. And it obviously comes with the legendary Al Michaels call, to which there's obviously a legendary movie made after. It is very memorable. There is no question that what Jesse Owens did in 1936 was more significant. For him to have won all those gold medals in Berlin in the shadow of that evil man goes without saying. It's one of the most extraordinary things in the history of sport, in the history of any sport. But memorable is the key word there. And so it's an excellent question and a very challenging way to answer it. And that, look, what Tommy Smith and John Carlos did is more significant than the Miracle on Ice. But memorable obviously applies any number of other, perhaps more qualitative elements. And so I'm not sure if that's a satisfactory answer to that question. I think it's the most straightforward one that I can provide. We're in the teeth of the Cold War. It's broadcast in our nation, on our home soil, our amateurs against their professionals. And so I think if you asked, we'll call it the median American, which is more memorable, not significant. Miracle on Ice is the most significant. Jesse Owens is the most significant, but Miracle on Ice is certainly the most memorable.
Yeah, could part of the answer or part of the why it's memorable center around the question of the underdog story? Yeah, I don't think that there's a question of, the Miracle on Ice represents the triumph of the underdog, but I think anybody, even back in the 1930s, understood that Owens was a tremendous athlete. So just on
no question about that.
Yeah. Got it. Yep.
Stan, we might have perhaps just one more question or time for one last question. So Stan,
hit me with whatever you got. I've enjoyed this very much.
Okay.
Oh, wow. Oh,
I'm just reading through my notes on Jesse Owens because he's featured in chapter 36 of our first book. And look, your question's an outstanding one. Again, I'm gonna go back to the disparity between the word significant and memorable, and I think I'm fairly content with where we netted out merely because of that qualifier, fair or unfair.
Yeah, got it. Another one, it was just a category, and as I recall it, it was the gutsiest or top 10. I think it was top 10 gutsiest performances
Yeah, love that
in
chapter.
sports of all time. Um, and it was actually really interesting. I think you had Tiger Woods. He's just basically fighting through his injuries. I think at or near the bottom of the list, and Michael Jordan's flu game at the top of the list. And interestingly, my reaction was I don't disagree with any of the elements on the list. It's the ranking of the list. So how did you decide that you were taking Jordan to number one and Woods to number 10?
So there is no question that Michael Jordan having the flu is not nearly as significant a hurdle in achieving performance on that day than Kurt Gibson on a broken leg, or Kerry Strug on an injured ankle, or Jack Youngblood, or Kurt Schilling's bloody sock, or maybe any of the other nine. The point, and the way that Greeny articulates this in the chapter, which I think is appropriate and well done, is the fact that the flu game became sort of shorthand for anyone saying, I'm going to perform well when I don't have my best stuff, performing well on an off day. Look, there's like every single season, an NBA player might wind up scoring 30 points and be sick. It's not the significance of that to me has far more to do with what it became, the fact that Last Dance sort of memorialized it, and the fact that this is my flu game is such a common expression in our language. Obviously, Tiger Woods winning the U.S. Open on one leg is a gutsier performance physically than what Michael Jordan did. But in the end, sort of like what we leaned back upon with our memorable Olympics moments list, is that sports legend and sports history, the way that we remember stuff, the way that it's been chronicled for us is sort of a curious thing. Obviously, Jack Youngblood going out there with a broken leg requires more guts than playing sick, playing with an illness. But in the end, ultimately, this is my flu game is so ubiquitous in our language that ultimately we decided that even though it was not the gutsiest, it was still the gutsiest, if you catch my drift.
Right. Got it. So are we, in fact, a softer generation? And is that why we prioritize the flu over, grievous bodily injury?
I think it's because we're utterly obsessed with Michael Jordan is the most straightforward way I can answer that question. Fair or unfair, right or wrong? I think that's the best way to answer that question.
That is a great answer.
All right, we may have time for just one more. Stan, any other thoughts?
Oh, go ahead, KP.
No, I think we'll just end with baseball. The most indelible baseball statistics, Hembo. I was surprised Babe Ruth's 60 wasn't there. How hard was it to leave number 60 for Babe Ruth off that list?
So it's a great question, and I originally had it on. I originally had 60 as one of the 10 most indelible, but ultimately we decided that 60 wasn't the figure that carried the most weight historically. It was the fact that it was broken with 61. If you had done the book 60 years ago, it would be one thing. But the fact that we went from 60 to 61 to 70 and 66 and 62 and all the numbers since then, yes, it's fair that Babe Ruth set that record. 60 was enormous. But look, when Babe Ruth hit 54, that was unprecedented too. When he hit 59, it was unprecedented too. Ultimately, Roger Maris hitting 61 and breaking 60 was the most significant part about the single season home run chase, if you will. So it's actually the right question to ask. And I originally had it on this list, but ultimately we decided that 61 and the gravity around that number was far more significant.
The book is called Gotcha Answers, the 100 Greatest Sports Arguments Settled. It's by Paul Hembo, Hembekides, co-authoring it with Mike Greenberg. We thank you for joining us, and thanks Stan Markotich as well for joining us. So go get the book, and again, appreciate your time, Hembo. Best of luck with this book. We look forward to the next one.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Talk soon.
Get the book. It's great. Oh, I was ranking your top 10 lists, and there's one that I think is perfect, by the way.
Which one?
If you were to take all your top 10 lists and rank them, who are the top 10 overall number one draft picks? That was perfection. There was nothing.
Oh, dude, that was so fun. And there's so many great There's so many great options for that. That's why it was so hard for us to nail it. But I'm glad to hear that you think we did. Let me pull up. That's page number 51. So that's so hard across all the sports. Obviously, the one thing I was concerned about was if we had Guy Lafleur a little bit too low. But it doesn't sound like you think so.
No, I mean, I could justify. I mean, you could maybe argue one way or another marginally, but as I looked at the list, I thought, no, I don't have any personally, no problem with any of the rankings.
That's amazing. Yeah, I mean, like obviously, like the pictures that we're settling these debates, and I think we do in some cases. But honestly, seeing the list in some cases stimulate more debate. That's kind of the whole point of this. It's an endless vicious circle.
Thank you so much.
Of course, I really had fun talking to you guys. You guys do a great job.
Fantastic. So again, get that book and best of luck, Hembo. We'll look forward to the next one and we'll chat again soon, I hope.
Later, friends. Take care.
Thank you, Hembo. Thanks.
Later, guys.